should be on. David's there. Hello, David.
Hello, friends.
How are you doing?
Fantastic. How y'all doing? Happy April 1st. That's exciting.
Oh, that's right. I completely forgot about that.
Yeah.
What is it?
April Fool's Day.
Oh, I didn't even think of that. Hi, Tabitha. Oh, Tabitha's muted.
But she's arriving.
Yes.
It takes a little while.
So, Yana, tell me about this backdrop that you always have. Is that actually on your wall or is that on your computer?
Yeah, this is painting actually the green one with the birds and etc.
Oh, okay, that's a real painting. Okay.
Yeah, but the other part is the virtual background.
I love it. I love
I
it.
still haven't figured out how to do that.
Yeah, I don't know how to do that either, actually.
It's
Oh,
the option of video.
Right.
No.
I see it now.
Wait, am I getting, okay.
I just don't hang out enough on Zoom, I guess, to figure out the details like that.
No? In your
No,
class?
I'm always, teaching a class or in a meeting or whatever. I haven't played played around with the little applications.
Yeah, recently I found out how to divide them in groups, which is really amazing.
Mm-hmm.
This reminds the leadership team of AQB that we're meeting, and because we have a small group, which is fine. We can keep it a little bit informal, but I thought people like Mahmoud wanted to join. So, hello, colleagues. The webinar on SPs is beginning.
Hi, Tabitha. How was your spring break?
I love that you're asking people how their spring break was. Does anyone have one?
What spring break?
That was just a mean question, Dave.
It's like, I used to say that April's the cruelest month because of senior projects and senior stress. And now I realize that pandemic April is truly the cruelest month, and April's easy.
Okay, well, it's 4:01. Should we get started? I mean, we're a small group, so I feel a little odd with such a small group being super formal. But we'll get started, and then maybe some others will join. And Nico and I are supposed to be co-facilitating this. So, but I think we all know each other. Do we all know each other on this call? We'll introduce ourselves anyway, because Tabitha, I'm not sure if you know what Nico and I both do. I'm Rebecca Granato. I'm based in different places, usually at AQB. Right now, I'm actually working out of Nairobi, where we have some refugee education programming going on. And it's nice to see you again, Tabitha and Nico.
Tabitha, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I'm Tabitha Ewing. Thanks, Rebecca. I'm in Annandale. I'm chairing the Social Studies Division at the moment, and I'm also a professor of history. We just had a meeting on Monday with all of the chairs or program directors of everything from anthropology to sociology and all of the rest of the social studies in between to talk about just this issue of boards and try and anticipate how best to conduct them productively for the students. And so I'm very interested partially to just hear what people are thinking about in terms of tech, but also maybe to weigh in a little bit about some of the experiences we've had so far. Anyway, great to meet everybody. Really nice to work across the network.
I'm super thrilled. I'm really pleased that you're here, Tabitha. I had found, to my chagrin, an email that I started this weekend. I found an email that I started writing you, asking you to be involved. That got buried under everything. So I'm glad you found it. Thank you.
Cool.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nico Veroli. I'm the core division head at Al-Quds Bard College, and I will be co-hosting this event.
So are we introducing ourselves, all of us? Like, Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Yana. Hmm?
I said, since we're such a small group, we might
Yeah,
as well.
I'm Yana. I'm heading the Human Rights Department at Al-Quds Bard, and yeah, I'm happy to join this interesting session and see what my colleagues will give us as suggestions in this kind of, modified conditions of work. Thank you.
And Dan, I think you're the last one. David, I think when my kids are screaming,
Okay.
you just-
Hi, Dan Terrace, Dean at Al-Quds Bard College. Sorry, I'm kind of walking around taking care of some other things here, but I'll be listening in.
And I'm David Chine. I'm based in Bard College in Annandale, where I teach in the philosophy program, and I'm one of the deans.
Good. Well, thank you, everybody. And I know this is a crazy time, so I'm glad that we have a good group here of folks who can brainstorm. Now, Nico and I had planned out something that was pretty formal that involved things like breakout sessions, but I don't think we'll be doing that given that we're kind of small. So we'll keep the group together unless suddenly we're bombarded with many more people. And we'll do this kind of informally and try to have somewhat of a robust conversation. So the idea behind this is to open up a discussion about best practices, both for advising senior projects and also for conducting the boards. And the way we've kind of conceptualized it is we'll talk a little bit about, we'll brainstorm a little bit about some of the best practices that we've used in the past in person, and then think a little bit about how we can translate some of those into the online format. We have a list of suggestions as well that we thought might be a good jumping off point for conversation. In terms of the boards themselves, so we have these two parts, the advising leading up to it, but also the board itself. And, one of the things that has struck me is that not only is it important that we are able to conduct the boards in a way where we can give proper feedback, where we can properly assess the students, where we can give a grade or a pass-fail, whatever our various institutions are deciding on, but also that we give the students the board experience. And I was saying to Nico right before all of you joined that back when I defended my PhD thesis, my twin babies who were just invading the room, they were born very early, and I ended up having to defend online. And what I was saying to Nico is that it was a real bummer. It was a real letdown. And what made me think about the board experience is the fact that I wouldn't want that to be the experience that a senior has when it's their very first engagement with this kind of experience. I was an adult. I'd already gone through a senior project and a master's thesis and all of that. But this is their very first capstone of the end of a really big part of their education. And I think it's worth paying attention to what that experience will look like for them if they have to do it online, which is likely in most of our institutions. So I wanted us to spend a little bit of time on that as well. Okay, so I thought as a brainstorming activity that maybe we would get started with a little bit of, in sort of IWT style, some brainstorming writing in a shared Google Doc. And I'm sure you've all been using Zoom, so you all know where the chat function is. But if you could just open up the chat function here in the Zoom, I'm going to paste in the Google Doc link, and you can open it up, and I set it so that we can all edit. And I would like you to think a little bit about this first prompt that I have in the column and to write under that column. So there's more than 6 places, so there's plenty of room. You can each take one line. And the question that I want us to consider is, think in short tweet-like fragments, if you will. So very, very short fragments. Principles and practices that have worked for you in the past when advising senior projects, but keeping in mind this face-to-face component. So think back to senior projects you've advised. What's worked for you? What kinds of practices? What kinds of principles? And let's just quickly make a list of some of those in this Google Doc. Okay, you will see that as you're finishing that up, I also pasted another prompt in. So as you finish up that column, you can look at the second one, thinking about the board specifically. So we have advising and then we have the board.
Sorry, Rebecca, do you mean expectations that we have of our advisees or expectations that our advisees have of us?
I was thinking of our advisees, but I think you could think about it. I think that's a really good question, Dave. I think both. I was actually thinking of, what we expect of the board, what we expect our advisees to do in the board, but I think thinking about it both ways is really useful in terms of the conversation that I want us to have. And I'll edit that. I added that in. That was a good point. Okay, we'll just take one more minute to get some initial ideas down. Okay. So Nico is going to jump in here as well, and we'll take a look at what everyone has written. Let's start with the advising column. So principles, practices that have worked in the past when advising senior projects, particularly in a face-to-face, since many of you probably have not advised online. So it looks like, regular meetings, fostering a relationship, creating ongoing conversation, looking at standards and substance. So standards in terms of substance, technical, it sounds like we have quite a bit of overlap here. Staying in conversation. Okay, so we're sort of intersecting in a lot of ways what we've come up with. And what we'll be doing is looking back at this list again and thinking a little bit about how we can do some of this in an online format. Nico, do you want to add anything to this?
No, I think, I'm just looking at everyone's experience and sort of learning from it, because mine with senior projects is limited. So I'm kind of taking things in, but I think the direction you're suggesting is great.
Yeah, so, but some of the sort of general themes are keeping the students connected with each other. I mean, I think Tabitha was the one who wrote about a writing partner and keeping the conversation going with the faculty member. These seem to be kind of critical to what a lot of us are writing in terms of feedback and also sort of reiterating what the students are doing. Now, if we think about the board, now David raised this interesting question about what they expect from us as well, which was kind of my framing for this workshop. So I should have included that. But in terms of what we expect of them, let's see. So some of what they expect of us, that we've read the material, that we've reflected on it. We expect them in turn to have reread it, bring a copy to the board, be prepared to engage and discuss. Let's see, what other kinds of, those kind of link with some of the other things that we're seeing here. Asking them to think about what else they could have done. So again, that the student needs to be prepared to be self-reflective. So this self-reflective component is important. Okay, so that kind of sums up, I think, what a lot of us wrote.
Rebecca, I'm sorry, I kind of misunderstood the question because I thought like you were asking in general. So something that I've encountered so far at AQB in general is that initially in the process, like students are not very familiar with the dynamic and the process advisee. So this is what I wrote. But you were expecting us to write particularly on the board itself. Okay.
It's okay. It's okay. Yeah. It's a big deal. I mean, I think we're generating some information to talk from here. Okay. So thinking about both advising and about the board. So, you know,
Rebecca, can I chime in with a quick question?
Yeah,
it's ahead. Tabitha here. I've been doing this for 20 years. Is this would you say that this format today is for somebody like me, or is it for somebody who's just beginning with the process?
No, I mean, I think that we can learn from your experience too of conducting senior projects. I think it just so happens that a couple of the people who have joined are a little bit newer. Jana and Nico are both at Al-Quds Bard, and we have a lot of faculty turnover. So what it means is our faculty are often only in their first or second year of advising senior projects. But I think the next thing that we want to talk about is transitioning to online and how we can take some of these expectations and translate them into an online space. So what I'd like us to do is sort of put this in the parking lot, so to speak. We're going to come back to this shortly. And to think now about the kinds of concerns we have, keeping in mind our expectations about transitioning to an online space. And I'm going to have us do this in another document so we can kind of have them side by side. So I want you to go to this website here and to enter this code, and then make a list or a couple of notes on concerns you have now that you've transitioned to an online space in terms of advising. So Tabitha, in your case, because you've been advising senior projects for 20 years, what are you worried about now? You have a really solid process. Can that process translate? Do you have any concerns about that? And those of you who are newer, likewise. Maybe you haven't done as many. What concerns do you have? And I will share my screen so we can see those concerns coming in. And then we're going to talk about some solutions too. So I'll shortly be sharing my screen. Was everybody able to get into the Menti? If you click on that link and enter the code.
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry. It took me a while to figure out how to unmute.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen momentarily. And then we will use this as a way to kind of think about the transition.
So just as a reminder on the Menti lists, what some of your concerns may be for transitioning the senior project board process to an online process.
I'm trying to get the screen sharing going. Okay, here it is. Okay. Was everybody able to get in? Because nobody has added anything yet. I just want to make sure that it's not an issue of people not being able to get in.
That's what you did.
Did it work? It should have worked. Okay. Let me try the screen share again. There we go. Okay, there we go. Now it's working. Hmm.
Hello, everybody. Sorry for disrupting and interrupting. This is Ahmed from AQB. I am sorry I didn't introduce myself. From the Recruitment and Communication Office, and joining in order to feature this event at AQB Facebook page and other social media.
Ah, but Ahmed, you are also a graduate, so you might have things to say about this too. So please feel free to be part of the conversation.
Yes, definitely. I wasn't following up what are you doing right now, but definitely I could share some parts of my experience.
Okay, I'll give it one more minute for folks to add concerns about transitioning. Oh, I wrote exceptions, not expectations. Just ignore my typo. It should say expectations.
I'm a bit lost. Do we need to write it on the web you sent us, or I'm a bit lost now?
If you go to that link and put in the code, it should prompt you to enter it.
Yeah, and also I'm unable to go there because you're sharing a screen, so I'm a bit lost now.
You can, okay, so no, I'm glad you're raising this. You can get out of full screen by hitting your escape button, or well, on a Mac it's escape. I don't know what it is on a PC, but you can get out of the full. You don't have to look at my screen share. You can still go to your browser.
Okay, now I got it. Yeah.
Okay, you can still go to your browser and you can still take a look.
Yeah.
I'm glad you're raising that, because this is something I want us to talk about with boards as well. And facilitating the board conversation might involve some screen sharing. So being able to do that with some seamlessness is important. So I'll give it a couple more minutes just in case folks had, is everyone able to get into the Menti? Nico, were you able to?
Yes, I was able to, yeah. It's just taking a moment for, at least for me, to think of, of the, concerns, just because I haven't had any time to think for 3 weeks, and I'm assuming other people must be in the same situation.
Okay, I'll give it a couple more minutes. Okay, so is anyone still typing, or can we open up the conversation? So we had quite a few best practices up there on our Google Doc of the kinds of things that have worked well for us in terms of best practices, including making sure students stay connected, making sure there's a relationship of trust built, making sure that the students are looking at the center of the project and, you know, going and sort of building outwards. And now we have to do all of this in the last month or 2 months, depending on when our projects are due, in an online format. Now I see out of these 3 responses that came in, the celebratory moment comes up twice. And this idea of losing the board altogether comes up, as well as this notion that the students may not be responding, or that it may just come down to kind of an email exchange, which isn't the most inspiring and also may not offer the most feedback to our students. So I want to kind of think about this in 2 ways. I want us to think about advising and brainstorm some best practices for advising, and think a little bit about the kinds of things we're already starting to do online, but other ideas that Nico and I have come up with that we might be able to share with you, and then we'll move on to the board. So let's start with advising and the lead up to the board over the next month, month and a half, you know, depending on how much time we have left. What are some things that folks are already starting to do to connect with your students and to maintain those principles and practices that you think worked well with your students when you were face-to-face? What are some things that you're doing?
I mean, I think one question I have for folks is, you know, who was meeting with their advisees face-to-face on a regular basis prior to this, and is now just an online format, and then how have you done that? Like, are you emailing mostly, or are you mostly having meetings via some kind of video link, Blue Jeans or Zoom? Or
This is Dan. I only have 2 advisees, but for me, it's working pretty much the same way it did before in face-to-face. I'm having Zoom meetings with my advisee who's regular, shows up and is making good progress, and my advisee who was intermittent in his attention to the senior project is still intermittent, but I did send him a WhatsApp and insisted that we have a Zoom conversation a couple days ago, so I tracked him down that way, and he promises me text. Vast amounts of text are about to appear. So I think for those 2, it's working pretty much. It would have worked. In other words, I'm still having one-on-one meetings with the one who is. He's sending me text regularly. I'm responding, and the other is acting pretty much the way he did when we were face-to-face. But I think he'll actually finish, but who knows what the quality will be.
This notion of accountability, I mean, Dan, I think you're right. We already had established relationships with these students, so chances are they'll behave similarly since we know their behavior patterns already. However, how do we ensure that they remain accountable? Are there techniques or approaches that folks have kind of thought of to ensure that the students do remain accountable? And as someone had raised this issue of students kind of getting distracted by all of the other things going on, which I think a lot of us are. I mean, I certainly have at moments. You know, how do we keep their attention focused on this? Are there any strategies that some of you have come up with to do this?
I think there's also another issue, if I may add to what you're saying, Rebecca, which is, you know, for us at AQB, access to library resources is in students' research process is fairly limited in any case, because the AQU library's holdings are very limited. But I wonder how people who students actually rely on the library for their research at Bard, for instance, how you're handling that situation, and how your advisees are, and what your concerns might be in that, or how you're adapting to this.
So just to sort of rephrase, this idea of accessing information, getting students to continue with their data collection, their gathering of materials, how do we kind of keep that going in an online space? Is that kind of what you're asking?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I realize that, you know, the Bard Library has lots of holdings that are online, but I wonder if the fact that students are no longer able to access the physical collection makes a difference.
Good question. I mean, we have creative fixes.
Tabitha, are you still on the line?
We might have lost Tabitha.
I know that this is something that the faculty in Annandale have been thinking about, and at least one of our colleagues in history in particular. So, you know, Tabitha, if you're still there, if you want to chime in. If not, I will jump in and say that, I mean, in terms of finishing off research across the disciplines, I think this is a complicated problem. Artists don't have access to supplies or canvases. We've got students who left their things in the library, right? Who have notes that are left in the library. And I think on the one hand, there's some pedagogical innovation that needs to happen here, right? At the end of the day, it may be possible that a student can't read the text that she had planned to read, or that we had planned for the student to read, and we're gonna have to figure it out, right? And there's some creativity. I've got some notes, I can scan them, you know, I can send them to you, what have you, but I think it's an opportunity for us as teachers to revisit the question of what the goal of the senior project experience is, and whether it's really about mastery of a particular literature or set of material, or the process of working through the year-long project. And I'm reminded here, and then I'll stop talking, of my colleagues in the laboratory sciences. And every year I'll talk to a couple of seniors in the sciences who are distraught because their experiments failed. They couldn't get the culture to grow, though this happened, that happened. And their faculty say, this is what the senior project is about. That's always happens when you're running an experiment.
Mm-hmm.
What we're training you to do is to figure out how to complete your experiment anyway. That's not a failure, that's part of doing it. In the relatively lush circumstances of teaching philosophy, where materials are readily available, we don't have that problem. Now we do. But it remains the case that my job as a senior project advisor is not to be sure that the student masters the particular philosopher or text, but the student's trained how to think through it. And sometimes that involves thinking around corners that pandemics put up.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And in terms of, you know, I think that's a really good point, Dave. And, you know, in terms of expectations of the senior project, you know, it may be that a full literature review is impossible, but maybe questions that the student wants to raise would be possible. The kinds of questions that the student might not have been able to finish in the literature review and, you know, fleshing out with the literature. So it may be that it's more of a questioning senior project than a concluding senior project. So maybe it's also a question of the advising kind of our expectations shifting as well. Another thing that I was thinking a little bit about in terms of encouraging students to continue to come to meetings and to be engaged in the meetings, even though they're happening online and not face-to-face, is to have the student kind of set the agenda for the meeting. And this is something I've done in person as well, but having the student really set out the questions that they want to tackle, the topics they want to tackle, the timeline that they want to be on, and have them really take ownership over that. I mean, that's one thing I was thinking of doing with my senior project advisees online, to make sure that they're actually meeting deadlines and that they're continuing to push forward and not being distracted by a lot of the other things that are going on. Yana?
Yeah, I want to share my experience, which is like quite limited because it's my first year, actually second semester that I'm doing this. But at first, I will have to say that we really need to be kind of acknowledging the situation they're going through, especially in Palestinian context. And in that sense, I think the entire situation with COVID-19 affects them like a lot. And that affects their, you know, focus and concentration in terms of wrapping up with the deadlines and, you know, exploring and expanding and yeah, researching more on the issues they're working on. So in that sense, I think we should definitely acknowledge the difficulty of the situation and the challenging circumstances, especially our students that are now in the moment. However, my experience is that the students themselves are, I'm advising three students, and they're quite responsible. So they write me an email, or we would like to meet in this new modified format. So we meet online, and they're basically the ones who are setting the agenda. I'm completely open to hear what they want to say, what they want to ask, what is their like kind of challenge in the particular chapter, section, conceptual, technical, etc. So in that sense, my only concern right now for the students is that the challenging situation there, especially in terms of, you know, Palestinian students, and in terms of, you know, the situation with the pandemic. So this is my only concern for them, because, you know, they're already having a lot of pressure in terms of, you know, what's going on, uncertainty, and those who are doing senior projects, they're pressured anyways. Even in normal times, they would be pressured to finish, but now this adds on them additional kind of burden that, yeah, I'm not completely sure how to handle it in a sense, but I'm trying to be encouraging with them and help them as much as I can through the project. Yeah.
So I think you're raising an important question. You know, one of the comments that came up in the Menti was about maintaining the rigor. You know, how do we balance maintaining the academic rigor with also acknowledging that, you know, there are very likely some major psychosocial challenges in all contexts. The Palestinian context, of course, you have the occupation layered on top of the senior project, but, you know, finishing a senior project is psychosocially challenging in any context, and the COVID-19 is psychosocially challenging. So what do others think about this, about maintaining academic rigor and, you know, encouraging that through advising, but while also acknowledging that this is a difficult time?
Rebecca, I have a comment on this. What I've encouraged Al-Quds Bard faculty to do is to think about encouraging students to perhaps limit the scope and the quantity of their senior projects but not sacrifice quality. In other words, if students don't have access to an archive or can't do as many interviews, or they need to cut out some part of their ambitious plan for their senior project, great, have them trim back the overall scope of it. Maybe it's somewhat fewer pages, maybe it's not as many topics as they did, but make sure that the part that they do is at the highest level of quality and polish. That's one way I've suggested, think for our faculty to think about this too, in light of the situation, both the psychosocial dimensions that Jana brings up and the issue of access to materials and research that others have brought up earlier. While I have the floor, let me just say one other thing, because I may have to go. One advantage of the current situation for boards in particular is that we have, although it's sometimes done already at AQB, bringing in somebody from Bard or from outside to sit as a third member of a board, we have an opportunity now perhaps to expand that to the extent that boards can take more advantage of third readers from around the OSA network. This might actually be a good thing for the network as a whole, as well as give the student a little more elevation. If they lose the celebration, at least they have, the sense they're participating in a bit more of a global conversation. So I wonder whether you or others from the OSA network might be able to help facilitate a process in which that helps make individual advisors at one college or another find it relatively easier to find volunteers from their field who might be willing to sit as third members of a board, since they're all likely to be conducted online anyway this spring. But it probably won't happen unless someone helps to at least grease the wheels to make it a little bit easier.
I think it's a nifty idea there.
I think that's a really good point, Dan. And one of the suggestions, you'll see I posted some suggestions into the chat function. The last suggestion is one that ECB it ties in with what you're saying. In order to make the students feel like they're part of a global network, what BCB is going to be doing, what I understand from James Harker, is they're actually going to be opening up the boards somewhat more publicly within the network, so that other students from other campuses could actually watch the board presentation and be part of it on Zoom. And what we were going to suggest is that this could be facilitated between, if we know it's a human rights presentation, then we could talk to Jana and see if there are any students at AQB working on similar topics who would want to join that board. Likewise, I think it would be great to connect faculty and to have them be external reviewers on the board, so that we can, I think that is a way that we can make this feel special, that it will be global and not just confined to AQB or to Annandale or to UCA, etc.
Yeah, can I just jump in? Because I already suggested my advisee to contact professors in Bard, with whom she was already in touch for some sections. However, I think she decided for someone else, but I think this is a great idea, and to have the boards open for the general public. I think it's awesome idea, actually, yeah.
So, I think David and I can talk about how to make that happen and actually create a kind of network of people who can, we can act as the connectors and facilitate those connections and help people actually get external reviewers. Some other ideas that we had for preparing for the board, in addition to bringing in external people, I posted it in the chat, but to have the student really be part of establishing what they want to get out of the board, and in a more concrete way than maybe some of us have done it in the past, maybe even through a shared Google document, something
Rebecca,
like that. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, but before we move there, I wanted to address briefly the idea of having external readers to senior projects. I don't at all mean to be I don't know, a stick in the wheels of that interesting idea, but I think we should be careful about that, because there are heterogeneities in the OSA network in terms of the expectations that various member institutions have of senior projects. I know at AQB that has been a subject of conversation, continues to need to be a subject of conversation. What exactly our criteria are for senior projects, and how do we formalize them? I suspect we would have to have some way of formally saying to external advisors, look, these are the criteria according to which we're judging senior projects, for them to be able to kind of intervene fruitfully in that. And that would be, from Bard Berlin to AQB, or from AQB to Bard, et cetera, right? Like the senior faculty at AQB have undoubtedly different expectations of their students than faculty at Bard do for what the finished senior project looks like. And not to think about that very carefully ahead of time is possibly to set students up for real disappointments, right? If their external readers sort of has very different standards than the ones that they're used to, they're going to get responses that they're not expecting at all, potentially. So I think that's something to really pay attention to if we go in that direction. How do we deal with that? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
I think with, in the case of AQB, I mean, we have clear rubrics that we use for evaluation. And I think we'd have to think with the other campuses and the leaders at the other campuses if they want to be part of this kind of exchange, and how to actually do it. This is something that we could actually talk about, and Dave, maybe we want to raise this. We could talk about this in the wider meeting on Thursday with the chief academic officers. I mean, maybe it's something that people would do electively, but I think you're right, Nico. But keep in mind, when we do our PhD defenses, there's always an external reader, and there's always a gap in what their expectations are too. So if it's done in a way that's not harmful, I think we could set it up so that it could be productive and not harmful.
I think, Dan, this notion of, right, these circumstances creating opportunities is one that I've been thinking a lot about over the past several weeks. And, I've had conversations with a number of colleagues across a number of campuses about the pros and cons and possibilities and difficulties of having advisors from other campuses. If I have somebody writing a project on something and you've got a faculty member who's got an expertise in that, how do we get them connected? And it's always been difficult because we're busy with our own campuses and our own students and our own lives, and how do we talk across campuses and rubrics and all these things? And so the conversations have never gotten very far. Now that everybody's going remote, right, and Dan from Boston may be involved in a conversation, in a senior project board that's happening in Abu Dhabi, all of a sudden things open up. And these boards are happening in a month, and probably we're not going to do this in a wide scale in the next month. There may be particular cases where it can be really quite helpful. But it's a conversation that we can now start having and continue. I don't think it's a yes or no, either or sort of thing. I think it opens up this really fruitful possibility of strengthening connections across the campuses. Maybe we'll only do it once or twice this year, but maybe there'll be 3 or 4 next year. That would be good.
Yeah, so I mean, even if it's just on a very small scale, it could just be a couple of times to experiment and to think about ways that the OSU network can support this. Okay, so I put up some other ideas here. We only have about 6 minutes left, but I put up some other ideas here of ways that we can get students prepared for their boards that we might not normally be doing. A couple of suggestions I had was to have students, rather than, even though they're doing a text-based project, maybe they could prepare a kind of image presentation where they're sharing their screen and they're doing an image presentation that reflects some of what they want to present about their project. There were some other guidelines in terms of, that I sort of came up with in terms of how to run the board. Now, this is probably the least interesting part of the conversation, but important nevertheless. sort of the logistics of running the board. And I just pasted some notes. For some reason, the numbers that I numbered these things, but they're not showing up. I'll share this out as a Word document too. But setting up the Zoom chat or the Google Meet or whatever so that the faculty member is controlling it and can ensure that the screen sharing is possible, thinking through those logistical things in advance, which you don't have to think about when you're doing things in person. I was going to show you a demo of the screen share, but does everybody know how to do the screen share in Zoom? I think there's only a few of us. We're all using Zoom pretty widely now. I don't think there's anyone here who's not using Zoom, so everyone probably knows how to do the screen share. Yes? If you don't, raise your hand. Your virtual hand. Okay, nobody's raising their hand. So I think we all know how to do the screen share. But being able to screen share things so that the student could screen share images or Tabitha does not know. Or the screen share could be for the text. Tabitha, do you want to see how the screen sharing works? Yes? Okay. So,
Yes.
for example, if you go in here, let me share my screen. I should be able to share this. Okay. Can you all see my Zoom screen now? What are you seeing?
Right now we're seeing a Google Doc.
You're seeing my Google Doc. Okay. So I don't know how to screen share Zoom.
Wait, no,
Problem.
Rebecca?
Yeah.
No, at the bottom of the screen, if you share again, at the bottom of the screen there, it says share screen, doesn't it?
Yeah, I know, but I did share my screen. It didn't allow me to share my actual, here, I'm gonna share it. Again, share my desktop.
You need to, open the file.
Should allow me to, no, I wanna share Zoom. I wanna actually share Zoom.
Okay.
It's not allowing me to do it, which is weird. Okay, well, let me tell you how to do it then, because I don't know why it's not allowing me to share Zoom. So if you go into the share option at the bottom of your screen, where looks like a little suitcase with a up arrow, and if you click on advanced sharing options, you can, in that screen, allow for either multiple participants to share simultaneously or for all participants to share. So that means the students could also share their screen if they wanted to share images, if they wanted to share excerpts from the text, if they wanted to share the whole project, depending on what it is that they want to share. But by enabling that all participants, you allow anyone to share. So the other, in terms of screen sharing, there's a couple of other tools that can be used for students to design a kind of presentation. You could use the basic PowerPoint, or there's another tool in here in the notes in the chat function that I pasted in called Presentio. And that one actually works quite well in terms of allowing students to plan something in advance. They can even put their PowerPoint in and they can do a voiceover. So it can be kind of they can prepare it in advance so that they're not talking live. So there's a couple of other tools like that allow for students to embed images, to embed sound, and to create a presentation that would be slightly different than just sharing their senior project as a text on the screen. Yeah, and then the last point that I was making was about this last point in the chat is about this notion of making the board feel serious. And I'm sitting here in a t-shirt right now in my bedroom, but for the senior project board, we can encourage them to set their own guidelines of what they want. Do they want to do it over coffee? Do they want to dress up in a suit? I remember when I, many, many, many years ago did my senior project at Bard, it was a really big deal. Tabitha, I think we share the same advisor, Alice Stroop. Well, Alice and Deirdre were my advisors, but Alice Stroop was on my board. And, we made it was a party. So how to kind of bring that element in, to make it seem kind of formal. And
one of our senior colleagues in anthropology, Mario Bick, Tabitha, you know this. The only times I ever saw him wear a tie were on moderation days and senior project days, because it was a formal ritual, and it ought to be treated formally. I think you're right. I think that in this remote setting, it is incumbent upon us as faculty advisors to think about and communicate in advance what the tone is. The thing. And to think also, and I'm going to have to jump off the call in a second, And it's interesting, right? As we're teaching our classes remotely, we're doing some blend of synchronous and asynchronous learning. I had a conversation this morning with a colleague who said that she's doing, she's not having full group sessions synchronously because some of her students don't want their classmates seeing what their houses look like, right? That their living situation is such that they don't want that broadcast to their classmates. Now, the senior project board, there aren't students in there. There's just the student and the board, but I think that's worth thinking about.
That's a good point.
I think it is important for advisors to have those conversations with their advisees in advance.
Not only that, but I know, I'm so sorry I had to step out for a minute and I didn't signal you guys that I had to do that. I had an important phone call that came in. So I don't know if you've already talked about this, but the level of tech stress among students, like we just assume because they're younger that they are comfortable with changing formats and adding new formats and, you know, creating PowerPoints and, you know, doing all of this other stuff. They are not. That is not consistent. Our students do not consistently have excellent internet access. And some students are going home to places where they don't even have a bedroom. They're sleeping on couches. They're crowded in their houses. They have gone home to family responsibilities. Now, I know some of you already have these, your students already have these experiences, but for students whose playing field was somewhat equalized on campus, the inequality of our students, from our students who heliski up in Canada to our students who may not have electricity, that's a reality of our circumstances. So I just want to signal, maybe you've already talked about this, that as clever and creative as we want to be with tech, we have to have asynchronous possibilities. And we have to be responsive to what David is saying about people not wanting to enter anybody, let alone faculty, into their homes. And how dare we even ask them such a question? So I think that we've got to find a way to balance a certain sensitivity with our enthusiasm for creating festive and rigorous relationship to the senior project. I don't think that that rigor is always going to be applicable in cases where there are people who are ill. I know in New York City right now, I can't always get the food that I want. People can't even get toilet paper. So again, I know some of you are dealing with these experiences which sound silly and very American in their preciousness. But I think we need to recognize that students' circumstances have changed from one day to the next. And to add this could be burdensome, not just pleasurable. So I just want to say that in some ways, the way that we're going in the division is whatever works. Yeah, it's good to have aspirations, but at the same time, we really need to have a backup number 1, a backup number 2, and a backup number 3. Okay, that's it.
Yeah, no, I think Tabitha, I think you're making a really important point. And I think that's where, you know, if a senior project board does need to be asynchronous for whatever reason, maybe the student doesn't feel comfortable, maybe they don't have internet connectivity, maybe they don't have power. There are many reasons, and we could all be facing the same thing. Some of these other tools for creating presentations could actually be really useful. It could be that the student puts together one of these presentations where they do have to learn how to do some kind of presentation, but a lot of the software is actually very simple. Like if you look at Presentio, it walks you through it, and they could do a verbal overlay to it, and then they don't have to do something synchronous. So I think there are some ways around it. And, you know, we're approaching the 10 a.m. mark Eastern Standard Time, so I know we have to kind of wrap it up. But I think what would be great is if folks have other suggestions for either synchronous or asynchronous boards, things that you want to add, you can send them to either me or to David, and we can share them out. If things come up in terms of, you know, the boards that you are running or other ideas for advising, please do share them with us, and we can make sure it reaches the wider OSUN network.
I wanted to say really quick, I have to run as well, but I want to say, Tabitha, you bring up a really good point. I think the the lesson I learned from it is that we need to work on expectations about an electronic board in conjunction with students and in a conversation with them, rather than imposing what our own expectations for what it should be like on them.
Yeah.
So that's a really useful point too.
Yeah, I think, you know, getting back to this notion of how to prepare for the board, and I'll share this out as a full document, having the students collaborate with the board to establish what they want out of it seems like a good preparation step. And that's where you can set a lot of the tone for, is it going to be synchronous? Is it going to be asynchronous? And some guidelines can be set. And that could be done in a variety of ways, I think.
I'm sorry, everyone. I have to run to my next meeting. So it was very nice to get to meet you, Tabitha. Ahmed, good to see you, if only as a picture. And Rebecca, we'll talk very soon to debrief.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye, Nico. Thank you.
Bye.